Good morning, everyone, or good early afternoon. My name is Cassie Hopkins, and I help run the webinars for Houseman Group. Thank you guys so much for being here. I'm just going to wait a couple seconds while people trickle in here. Hello, Becky, David, Carrie, Tammy, Tyler. We've got lots of familiar names in here. Nice to see you guys. So we are going to get started, but I want to get some housekeeping items out of the way first. So this familiar or not so familiar face is Dylan Francis. He is replacing Kevin Tadich. Kevin had a last minute emergency, so we are so grateful for Dylan to be able to step in and speak for this because of the last minute change. We may not be able to answer as many specified questions as we were hoping, but please still answer your questions or ask your questions so that we are still able to see them, and we'll still get them over to people who would be able to answer them. So if anything comes up and you have a question, you can put it in the Q&A or in the chat and we will see it, and we'll have a formal Q&A at the end of the webinar. A couple more things. This webinar is recorded, which means you are going to get a copy of it delivered to your email, as well as a copy of the presentation slides. You can share that with anyone that you'd like, or if you need to bounce out of the webinar early, you can always return to where you left off. The last thing I will mention is that Arctic Wolf has generously giving $50 Amazon gift cards to everyone who stays till the end of the webinar. So if you would like that $50 Amazon gift card, just make sure you attend the full webinar and it will be emailed to you within 48 hours. Without further ado, I'll have Dylan take over. Thank you so much for being here.
All right, sounds good. And hopefully everybody can hear me okay. Yeah, just a couple of quick things. So, yeah, I'm not Kevin Tadich by any standard, but certainly I'll do my best to fill his shoes. I'm Dylan Francis. I'm one of the lead incident responders that you would often see on the worst day of your professional career. Definitely dealing with the ins and outs of all things cyber incidents on the reactive side of things. Hopefully, after today's presentation, you all feel inclined to do the more proactive side of things. But with that, we'll just dive into our slides here today. With that, if we can get our screens to there, it goes. Just a couple of quick agenda items I always like to kind of go through, just kind of what we'll be talking about today. So we have our cyber threat landscape. That's very hard to say this morning. Cyber claims process, tales from the trenches. So that's a little more of I call them fun stories, but as you can imagine, you kind of lose a little bit of your humor as you start going through all these cases. The good, bad, and ugly definitely starts to show. So that's bullet three there. And then for topic four, are you ready? And talking through our incident response readiness process. So with that, we have a typical question I often get, especially when I'm looking at this slide and even just from various industries, is what industry is more immune to cyber incidents versus another? And one of the questions that I like to kind of throw back to you folks is, what types of incidents would you expect to see? If you're talking, say medical type of client, you may not see your typical business email compromise case as you would, maybe another industry, you may see more of the ransomware. So something a little bit more disruptive. But there's not one engagement type over another that's going to be like, hey, because you are construction, because you are education, you're only going to see this incident type. It's just unfortunately, you got to think about the types of products that are being exploited here often are not present in those various organizations. These stats are from, October 2023 to October 2024, kind of gives you that sort of breakdown of our general year in scope. But again, it's one of those things, it's a mixed bag. If a manufacturing client has, traditionally, say, one type of firewall product, that firewall has a massive exploit, we may see some of these numbers adjust. I wish I could say, hey, because you're one over another, you're completely immune, but unfortunately, that's just the nature of the beast we have here. Moving into ransomware and data extortion, I would say this makes up the biggest chunk of the pie that we just looked at there. Really, from a top three perspective, I would say manufacturing, healthcare, and construction are the top three that I typically see on a day-to-day. But again, I mean, you can see they're all pretty much a neck and neck here. That ransomware and data extortion does make a pretty big aspect of this incident. Again, it's a lot more disruptive. The business email compromise cases, sometimes those do loom a little bit longer just for the fact that you may not see that your email is compromised before you see a giant ransomware note either on your printer or your desktop or anything like that. Overall, kind of gives you an idea that, we're not all immune, but you can certainly kind of put two and two together that certain industries may have more data of interest to a threat actor than maybe some of the others. So why your incident readiness matters here. So a lot of different things kind of, to look at here. So again, going into our overall incident types here, again, ransomware data extortion, but network and host intrusion, that's kind of your more pre-ransomware type situation. So if left untreated, likely will result in the larger part of that piece of pie there. But then you do have the business email compromise cases. These are just a little bit more, that annoying, spam that turns into access to your email. And so one of the things that we do want to highlight, and this is something that I think a lot of folks don't really highlight enough, is that on average, we're seeing about a $600,000 ransom demand. So obviously, this is going to kind of depend on the size of your organization, the threat group we're talking with, the types of data that you may have. So to that perspective, I think this number actually may be a little bit higher than even that 600,000 mark. But to that perspective, it's a number that most folks don't have sitting in their back pocket. Most organizations don't have enough sitting in the savings bank just to shell out a $600,000 demand and basically make everything go away. And I will say too, at the end of the day, we're trying to trust criminals. And so when you're thinking about an incident type, 600,000 to make your problems go away still has that sort of implication of A, was it a sanctioned entity that you weren't supposed to pay? B, are your customers still impacted? Is that data being suppressed and then potentially going to be further, extorted once, the threat actor feels that they've spent enough time? So again, those are the sort of things that even with that $600,000 ransom demand may still be something you want to consider as you're preparing for a potential incident. So root cause, this is also a very important piece. So thinking about when you're calling up your IR firm, you want to know how it happened. If there's a giant crack in your foundation of your home and your house is starting to, slip down the hill, you want to know what is causing that in order to actually fix it. Is it a sinkhole? Is it, some sort of, structural damage? Was it something that was not properly implemented at the start? Those sort of discussions are something that we talk about in IR planning. Because at the end of the day, if you're at the worst day of your professional career, you don't want to be talking about how did the fire started. You just want to know like what can we do to prevent the fire from, spreading, and we just want to get it under control. So, all to be said, most of the time we're seeing external remote access, open RDP. I would love to say in 2025 we don't have, ports open to the internet. Unfortunately, management consoles are often still publicly facing. Folks use it for obviously being able to work from home and all those sort of opportunities allow remote access into your internal network. So just being able to make sure that we tighten down controls as much as possible, truly make sure that, again, you're not going to completely avoid having a breach, but as a result, we may be able to reduce the actual exposure here. So and then in terms of IR planning, average cost of a breach is 1.4 million, actually almost 1.5 million for that matter, is what we're seeing on average for that sort of planning. So if you want to think about the cost savings there, if we can avoid having a breach entirely, I know that's a big word, the big breach, big B word breach. So anybody that is legal or former legal, you definitely know that's a word that we try to avoid here. So to that perspective, that high level amount of planning truly avoids us having any sort of inadvertent data exposure, communications, or anything that may result in that inevitable B word. So I would say the biggest thing about having a good IR team really looks at what services can they provide. And one of the biggest things that I love about our team is the ransomware negotiations. Our threat actor negotiations team is, I mean, top notch. I love every single aspect of their communications and even just the tactics that they're doing. They're not trying to just say, hey, there's that, again, we go back to that 600,000 median ransom discussion there. They're not just looking at that number and say, hey, cut the check, let's be rid of this. They're trying to look at how can we reduce that final payment. So if we're looking at, total ransoms demanded of, 23 million and some change there, one of the biggest things that we're trying to do is make sure that if you do inevitably have to pay that ransom, and especially if you're, say the insurance carrier having to pay that payment, we want to make sure that you're not paying that. At the end of the day, we're trying to keep money out of the bad guys' pockets. We're not trying to help them buy that, new fancy sports car or island in the middle of the Caribbean or whatever it may be that they're trying to buy with this, stolen money at the end of the day. We're trying to get that ransom down. So seeing the final ransoms paid by our team, in this case of 6.7 million, that's a 71% reduction. And I would say is a huge win. If you're talking any of these big scary numbers, we want to make sure that, again, that money's staying out of that threat actor's pocket. And so, really the what happens when an incident occurs, there's a lot of pieces to this. So, I know a lot of you, of course, are at different facets within your current roles, but one of the biggest things we start with is incident discovery. And so really just detecting the activity, understanding, what is happening. Ultimately, this should be happening in the organization. If we're coming to that first scoping call, hopefully it's not just as we're in that discovery phase. Hopefully, there's been a little bit of information gathering. And so, with the claims, excuse me, sorry for that. With that claims process, our hope is that as we are getting engaged with insurance or even privacy counsel, they've done some of their information gathering. We hope we hop in that first scoping call and really start understanding what's going on behind the curtain. And so whether it's a network intrusion case, ransomware, business email compromise, all those have different sort of timelines that we often see in my role. So that initial incident discovery piece is key. Because if we don't know what we're dealing with, we may inaccurately try to represent your organization. And then, of course, start moving down. And apologies, my screen's updating here. So we'll go back to that. Hopefully, you can all still see the slides there. So, overall, immediate IR coordination is key. So when you're picking your IR vendors, again, we have pretty fast response times here. So I never really have a concern if someone's calling up Arctic Wolf, whether it's through our web portal or engaging through various channels, you're going to get in touch with one of our teammates pretty quick. And that's key. If you're dealing with a ransomware incident or an active encryption event or even an email compromise where you have wires being misdirected, you want to make sure that that IR firm is there, ready to help, and that they know who they need to call. So if I'm hopping on a call and it's just the end client and Arctic Wolf, we're going to also recommend that there's a privacy counsel engaged here. 9 times out of 10, insurance, of course, is going to dictate that there should be privacy counsel involved. Sometimes the client doesn't want to call upon those various parts of the process. So overall, that immediate coordination, it takes, a whole mountain of people to make sure that we have the proper response here. So that's one of the things that whether it's the carrier, client, or even the IR firm, we all try to just make sure that we're bringing in as many people as we need here. And then, of course, investigation and compliance. One of the biggest things that I'm focusing on a day to day is just making sure that our investigative findings are something that's going to be A, helpful to the client, because at the end of the day, they're the ones that are being, negatively impacted through this incident. But B, we also just want to make sure that any of their impacted clients are being properly addressed through, again, ideally privacy counsel, giving them the legal and regulatory obligations they may have here. And then, of course, giving any sort of remediation um, tactics that we can certainly give to them. So, of course, thinking about the insurance hat, if we want to put that on for a second, you want to make sure that your actual end client is better protected through this incident. Ultimately, the client that, for underwriting said, hey, we need to get rid of this one particular phone system, and they say, yep, we did that, Mr. Insurance. We don't have that anymore. And if that was root point of compromise in our investigation, it's certainly a discussion point that I know a lot of times we've had with insurance of, this is how we can mitigate our risk, but maybe, that client had that inherent risk that they brought back online. And then overall business continuity. So really, we often see that insurance carriers are covering the IR costs. And so that's usually an advantage that some of the clients see. They may not know that their policy can cover most of what they're going through. So they just may avoid calling insurance entirely. So one of the biggest things that I advocate for is that our clients see if they have a cyber insurance policy, and if they do, see where their deductibles might be, because ultimately those ransom payments, breach notifications, privacy counsel, all of it starts to add up so quickly that, what they may see is a very high target may actually be a lot more approachable for them in that process. So again, having that initial touch point ahead of a breach is certainly one of the best things that we see as folks are responding to their various IR plans here. And then post-incident, of course, we want to close out the engagement better than we started. So, we always kind of make the joke we'd rather meet over a round of golf than over any sort of incident again. So, we want to make sure that post-incident insurance gets a little bit of a debrief of our incident findings. Data privacy attorneys are certainly going to close out the investigation with our executive summary style report. And then, of course, making sure that the IR teams give all the information over to the various stakeholders, making sure that of the covered costs that they had, any final documentation and policy evaluations can be done for them. So I would like to call this is the war story part of the investigation. So, or of the investigation. As you can tell, I'm usually behind the the screen doing the analysis here. So, um, I like to call this the good, bad, and the ugly. So having your IR plans established before the breach totally makes a huge difference in our response efforts. So, the first one I want to bring up, I have our mid-sized law firm case. This one was very heartbreaking. They came in, whole mess of encryption across their massive network. They had printed off ransom notes, all the fun things that our threat actors like to do to be disruptive and very present. So, this organization, of course, trying to be proactive, they said, "Hey, who's our preferred vendor?" They, called us up. We started working, and as we are in the middle of the investigation, we're starting to get to the answers. We're told, "Hey, pencils down. Our insurance actually does not, you know, currently approve Arctic Wolf." So that being said, we said, "Okay, understood." So we have to wait. Now that lapses about, a week or two, and then finally they say, "Actually, you know what? Because they've already started the investigation, we do, approve them. It's just maybe they weren't, there was a miscommunication, anything of the sort." So it immediately brought this, instant, hey, what could have been this client being up and running, by the end of the first week. All of a sudden we have this 2 week lapse that we can't do anything to give them their answers that they need, restorative efforts, anything of the sort, and all because they didn't first call their insurance. And so knowing who you need to contact, understanding if it's the right policy, all those different factors are huge in understanding your IR plan. Um, the next one I like to give is our arts and culture. So this was a very, I don't even want to call it painful. Painful is like an understatement up to this particular incident. So it was a very prominent arts and culture organization. They were hit with a ransomware incident that impacted not only their website, but their box office and pretty much everything from the, everything outside of their physical stage and the physical performers that were going to be on that stage, everything was impacted. They had a massive show coming up, and frankly, they weren't able to literally do any of their operations. So, it's not the old 1930s where you have a single spotlight on a wooden stage. Obviously everything's got a lot more physical involvement to a network. So this client engaged their trusted privacy law firm that they already had on retainer. They had their insurance partners. They knew, kind of what they needed to do, but they opted to bring a different unvetted IR firm. So one that was not on the insurance panel. They just said, "Hey, we have a friend that does forensics and restoration and recovery. We're going to just go with them." So insurance inevitably just said, "That's fine. Like, this is your choice. We can't, like, we're going to keep encouraging you to go towards the Arctic Wolf route." But, that being said, the client said, "Nope, we're going to use our own vendor." So then Arctic Wolf came in and we were brought in just for negotiations. So our threat actor negotiations team was in the sidelines trying to work with this unvetted IR firm. They're getting as much intel as we can, but effectively our team was just waiting in the wings. For any of you theater folks, that's a fun little joke there. So, uh, really just kind of seeing how that organization is going to feed us back the information that we need to be providing into our threat actor negotiation. So our negotiation was trying to see if there's any encrypted files. Are we able to, restore based on current backups? All this information, a lot of disconnect, and eventually, one of the biggest things that we saw was just there was not enough communication from all parties coming into what they needed in the IR firm. So as this team is trying to respond, get ready for show week, all the fun things. We come to back to the playbook of there is no standardized IR plan. There's not really a standardized practice when it comes to every individual organization, but there are certainly things and certain processes that can make things easier. So again, having that trusted IR firm could have certainly alleviated some stress. And so one of the things that we saw with our client, and we certainly saw with their MSP partner, was, there was a lot of unnecessary expenditure, and a lot of that came through just who they kind of knew at the time of the incident. So we had expensive boots on the ground, and by we, I should say the other IR firm. They recommended 15 individuals come and be flown out to the client, only for forensics to take about 2.5 weeks. This was not only redundant, but it was time consuming. They also had data validation through all of their findings. So if they found any sort of data that they wanted to restore, they were running it through not only, I think they had at least two, if not three, different EDR tools they wanted to deem the data safe before bringing it back online. And then from that point on, I mean, the client just was forced to remain without their critical data. I mean, they're getting close to show week. They haven't sold any tickets. They don't know if anybody that bought tickets still has tickets. And so all these IR recommendations that they had internally left the client in a tough spot. So understanding their struggle for forensics and restoration services directly impacted our ability to have a successful negotiation with the threat actor. So after weeks of pretty much no progress and a lot of expenditure for boots on the ground resources, our team came in and within only about 48 hours, we had a full root point of compromise. We understood what was going on from the threat actor's perspective. We had restored systems for this client, and our negotiation went seamlessly into um, basically virtually no expenditure on the actual ransomware payment. So all of that happened in a few business days of us just having boots on the ground virtually rather than having 15 of our teammates just sitting in, a conference room just trying to find the evidence, so to speak. So it was a very critical piece of, if you have the right plan and you just listen to your insurance carrier and who they're saying for this particular type of investigation, it would have gone a long way. I would say the more good stories would probably be more, so we'll talk about these in like the little blue section here. So, um, one of the biggest things that we see our threat actors trying to target is those, kind of easy one-time hits, large payout kind of customers. So I would say managed service providers are one of the most valuable targets that we see currently for threat actors. So one day we had an MSP client that noticed a mouse cursor just moving across the screen. So something as simple as just, hey, your mouse is just doing one of these little things across the screen. And thank you to them and their, all of their preparedness strategies. Arctic Wolf was able to actually act quickly and engage our forensics team, restoration team, remediation team, get this all contained and monitored throughout a very short period of time. So we responded quickly and discovered that a threat actor was present in the network, exploiting one of Citrix's ADC vulnerabilities. So this would be CVE 2023-3519 for anybody that wants to look that up. And they moved honestly through the network pretty quickly, compromised the domain controller, installed a few RMM tools, so remote management tools that basically maintained the persistence and allowed the threat actor to, keep a foothold on the organization even if we shut down a specific user account. Also allowed them to move to other systems, but thankfully, as they were starting to move laterally, we kicked them out of the network. As you can imagine, timing plays a huge role in this. So being able to have that plan, know who to contact, what accounts have this sort of elevated level of access, what systems are critical to your organization, allowed us to shut that down a lot quicker. Our team also neutralized the threat actor before any attempts at a ransomware or data exfiltration event occurred. So really great. They were just doing some information gathering, and we were able to shut them down before they had any loss of data. And then the client was able to get back in business just in about 2 days, which is a very short time period given that they were basically pencils down, everything's on fire. We, are scared that something bad's going to happen. And so despite the malicious activity on the network, and we were able to have some pretty good response times and stop a threat actor right in his tracks. So that's always a good win for me is, even if we do see the threat actor moving around, if we can shut him down before anything else bad happens, that's huge. And then this one I remember vividly. So, um, this was a health and fitness organization that had a specialized local guest user account that they used for basically appointment management for all of their clients. So one morning they received an urgent message from the insurance carrier actually saying that, hey, we just wanted to let you know that the special guest account was sold on the dark web, and it looks like an initial access broker may be, circulating this for reuse. And so it was only a matter of time before the threat actor attempted access, as we definitely anticipated. And it was an account that was just recently paid for, so exfiltrated, say a week ago, and then being sold off and used. So the client had to get to the bottom of their initial access and lock down the network before the threat actor could actually destroy things, which inevitably they try to do. So luckily, the client was very supportive of the cyber insurance basically claim here. And so they said, hey, whoever you want to bring in, we, greatly appreciate your proactiveness as the carrier to letting us know. So they said, hey, we're going to bring in our trusted partner, Arctic Wolf. Luckily, this client was being actively supported by their internal stakeholders. And so they said, that's cool. Within hours of the insurance notification, our team began a full investigation, contained the threat actor, performed full remediation services, and based on the available evidence, we actually were able to identify the first sign of unauthorized access occurred via their VPN, which actually had a misconfiguration, allowing MFA to be bypassed by the threat actor. So one of those things that threat actors themselves, they may simply sell the access to other attackers to carry out the crime. But if you have these sort of weakened controls at the front, again, it's kind of like having, the fence to your farm wide open. It's nice to have a fence keeps everything corralled, but if they're still at weak point, you may not be able to get the threat actor contained there. So, um, one of the things that we saw here was, unfortunately, it is possible that one or more threat actors could have been trying to exploit these user accounts, but with our remediation work, the client gave us full visibility into their network and ensured um, that the threat actors were not able to re-enter after we were done with our response. So um, overall, we left on very good terms with this particular client. We were able to get them some pretty good information into how the threat actor gained that initial access. And then for this kind of specific, one device misconfiguration allowed us to further, bolster their investigation by saying, here's some things that we can do to make sure that this does not happen again. Obviously, vulnerabilities, those 0 days that we always talk about and hear about, they do happen. But if you have misconfigurations from the beginning, it's just like having Swiss cheese and trying to run water through it. Like at some point, things are going to get through. You just want to make sure you plug those holes as quick as possible. And then all around to be said, I would say having a plan is the biggest thing that I would love to see every organization have. That's first and foremost, probably the biggest thing in having a response is, more often than not, I come in and it's the digital or physical metaphorical binder, however you want to look at it. And it's covered in dust. They have not looked at this plan since it was probably created. I've had plenty of times where the IR plan is like, hey, Dylan, here's your IR plan you requested, and it's a point of contact that hasn't worked at the organization in years. Or it's someone that's been promoted 16 times and they have a new phone number. All these different things lead to a very disruptive response process. So our IR plan is going to be reviewing this on a lot more frequent basis than most organizations do. So that's something that, even if the bare minimum you do for an organization is have an IR plan, it's huge to make sure that it's regularly looked at. Because if we're trying to call someone in the middle of, the worst day of their professional career, you want to make sure you're calling the right person. We had a person that basically ended up calling like a local Domino's, and it was because they're, what used to be the trusted phone contact for, say Cassie Hopkins, who's on the call here. Unfortunately, Cassie was not at that phone number anymore, and here we are. So, the biggest thing that I'd like to say is these five pillars are not exclusive to one another. You can't necessarily say one is better than another or one's more important than another. All have an important piece in making sure that we have the proper plan in place for your IR investigation. So, the biggest thing I would say is identifying an internal response piece or response team, I should say. Um, those key stakeholders, backup contacts, all ensures that we properly identify who we need to call at the time of an incident. The biggest thing is that, if someone's on vacation, as an organization, are we going to call that person on vacation? Do we have a backup point of contact? If the, internal phones are down and we can't call extension, 1, 2, 3, 4 for, the C-suite, are we able to still contact somebody that we need to escalate on behalf of whatever incident is occurring? And honestly, I've had plenty of incidents where even an IT manager calls their buddy's local IR firm only to find out that the company actually has the company as in the organization we're representing here. The IT manager doesn't realize that there's a cyber insurance policy. And so they get kickstarted on that nice little investigation. We have a $50,000 bill already racked up. And then they realize, oh, if we only asked our insurance carrier, they may have told us we can't work with that vendor. And we actually need data privacy involved. And because we didn't do that, our whole investigation that was done without attorney-client privilege. Now there's additional risk there. And so all that comes from we did not have a proper response team in place. We just had kind of a haphazard, hey, if this person sees something, say something, but there was no policy to follow. And so external providers is a big piece in that too. So kind of alluding to the internal context and who can kind of make these initial decisions for the organization. Knowing your list of current vendors and technical contacts is big on so many levels. So we've had incidents where the organization just says, hey, we have a bunch of cloud backups. We don't really know where they're sitting, but we know we have cloud backups somewhere. And one of the biggest pain points that I've ever run into is that they don't have a current vendor list. So the organization that we had, it was a medical client. They said, we know we have everything at a, cloud backup provider, and they gave us the person. that we needed to contact. Well, the person no longer worked there. By the time we got in touch with somebody for their backups, we had found that they haven't paid their subscription in over 5 years. So, as you can imagine, if you think all your backups are going somewhere for the last 5 years and they're not, it's definitely a pain point when you're trying to rebuild. So, all to be said, having that current list is huge for us because at least as we're trying to get you back online and prioritizing the various systems at the time of an incident, having those contacts is going to make sure that we properly contact the right folks as we do that. So, one of the biggest things as you're doing your IR plan, our particular planner here is going to identify not only those IT providers, but you're going to be talking about IR providers. So, knowing who you can call if you do have an incident. Best case scenario, you have that complimentary scoping call, and we say, hey, you actually don't have an incident here. But if you do have an incident, still knowing that if you pick up the phone, we're going to be answering at the end of the day. We also identified data privacy counsel. So again, this is one of those situations that maybe not all incidents warrant counsel, maybe they do. That's certainly a insurance question. It's a client decision. You know, do we want to pay for this every single time that there's a suspected incident? But to that perspective, having all of these different key players already listed out in a plan ensures that you actually call the proper folks when you do have that incident. Um, and then I would say if you look across the five pillars for me, network information, again, I'm your data guy. I'm the one that's typically working on the incident. I won't say this is more crucial than another, but having your entire network outlined in any capacity helps responders like myself know where to go at the time of your incident. So, I think for any of you folks that have ever traveled, you go to a hotel and there's that fire evacuation plaque on the back of your door. Or if you're in an office building, here's how you get out or in the event of an emergency. So similar to that, where is your network map? Does your organization have a network map that we can actually refer back to at the time of an incident? Because the worst thing that I can ever run into is that everyone says, "Oh yeah, we have all of our systems together. We're gonna create like a new network map." John over in IT knows that we have X, Y, and Z, and then HR has all these systems. And I think we have everything. But the think and the I assume, those assumptions are huge and negatively impact us as we're trying to make sure that you have proper documentation moving forward. So as we're planning for, an incident, again, the IR planner is hoping that it's ahead of any of your future incidents and hopefully never an incident at all. But again, it's unfortunate, but many incidents are inevitable and, very hard to prevent. But if you can do enough restrictions at, the front hold of it, if you think about a bank, you're not going to store your money in the middle of the parking lot. You're going to put it in the middle of a safe, which is in a, closed vault door inside a building, maybe behind a fence with an alarm system. There's a lot of defenses. So even if that threat actor gets into the parking lot, we may already have someone reacting to that situation. So that's really the biggest thing is having those controls that, keep stopping the threat actor through every single part before they get to what they're looking for. So again, I would say the biggest thing that I run into is if we don't know where everything lies, it's going to be harder for us to respond. So we'll run our various network scans and we're going to do as much network information gathering as we can. But if your team doesn't have a plan going into the incident, it's very hard for us to figure out what's going on behind the curtain. And we're going to have to just, slow down the process and keep trying to find all these little outlying pieces. Instant escalation. So this is definitely one that really just make sure we align our SOPs. So making sure that, the documented SOPs and the assumed SOPs for an organization are all aligning. So, thinking about most organizations have some sort of disaster recovery plan. So if there's a fire in the building, how do we react from that? But do we have one if there's a, digital disaster? When that alarm bell is going off, do we know who to call? Like we know to call 911 in the US if there's a fire, an emergency, or anything. But when there's a data incident, do we have that same sort of policy in place? Do we know who to contact? How do we contact? If there's some sort of incident that we know how to do from a physical perspective, again, is the digital actually going to reign true in that same way? So, is there a monitoring service, security monitoring service, MDR service, et cetera, that you need to escalate your incidents to? Because maybe it's something as simple as just right click on, I don't know, a button on your desktop that says report security incident, and maybe that's all your end users need to do. But the biggest thing is knowing who to contact in the middle of those incidents. And typically, it's not your end user notifying your customer of, hey, we just want to let you know we're having some sort of data issue, it's probably a breach, I don't know. And then unfortunately that starts to cause some other alarm bells to go off. So incident escalations can definitely make or break our investigations. And so the army that's appointed of people, those like external providers especially, we're trying to make sure that nobody has any sort of negative impact to the incident. So understanding there's going to be probably legal and regulatory notifications here, we just want to make sure that we're not inadvertently notifying impacted users ahead of doing a full investigation. We want to make sure that there's no inadvertent publications to news outlets. I did have a case where the National Guard was deployed because we just, the things that were said, unfortunately, made it seem like there was more of a physical threat to the organization. Like it was just, there's a lot of different responses that, unfortunately, if we don't have a plan and we don't know who to contact, we don't have the proper response channels and proper responses externally, we may have some issues that, either cause an issue for your current clients, or I even think about it too from a threat actor perspective, possible retaliation from the threat actor. If the threat actor knows that you're trying to, bust their decryption or you're trying to basically circumvent their process or, anything of the sort, we may see some issues that we're trying to better protect from that organization. So um, I would say overall is just making sure that if you're going to have a communication channel in place, making sure it all funnels through consistently regardless of the situation. And the last, but certainly not least, is your critical systems. So having that inventory, I cannot stress this enough. So I've had plenty of organizations that say, oh no, we need XYZ systems in order to maintain operations. And as we're working to clear these systems and understand what happened for the incident, we'll, get a nice little phone call, email, text message, you name it, we'll get communicated to, oh, actually, we don't need, DC1, we actually need, HR, 201 because that actually is going to deal with our payroll tomorrow. And if we don't pay that, hey, Johnny's not going to get his Christmas gifts. The company bonuses won't go out. Whatever it might be, we start to find out these critical systems that weren't initially critical. And then all of a sudden, as they start to realize, hey, without operations, we don't have these certain things. So, say the organization uses Google Workspace, Office 365, can we maintain some sort of business continuity while we're trying to get back online? Those are all the various key pieces that I often are asking because ultimately, if all your systems were down today, can we still do anything as an organization? Can we at least keep the lights on in some capacity, keep manufacturing going down the product line, anything of the sort while we're doing that analysis there? So overall, again, these five pillars, again, I'm not going to say one is better than another. As your responder, I'm going to definitely say knowing who to contact, how to contact, and even just knowing anything about the organization is big. Because if we're going to respond to an organization and the client says, oh, yeah, just contact John, and then HR says, John hasn't worked here in X amount of years. That's not a great start to our investigation. Let alone too, I would say the biggest thing too is like understanding with all these response teams, who are the backups in place? Do we have a handoff procedure in place? So, we've seen plenty of times where medical incidents have happened as a result of a physical, or not a physical breach, but a data breach here. So, to that perspective, do we have someone, ready to relieve, say, the CISO? If he's been running on all cylinders for the last 72 hours, hasn't slept, he's sleeping under the or napping under the conference room table, not eating, that's not a very healthy decision maker that we're going to need as we're going through the parts of the incident. So always having that handoff is key. Um, but I could go on and on about all the different war stories, the good, bad, the ugly. But with that, I guess, are there any questions that I can answer for any of you folks on the call today? I'll have the webinar chat up and certainly feel free to bounce anything off myself. And I see Cassie as well. So happy to answer anything that you guys may have. Don't all jump at once.
No worries. If there are no questions, we'll get out here just a little early. Thank you again so much, Dylan, for stepping in last minute and offering to do the webinar for us. We really appreciate it. Just an FYI for everyone still on the call, if you wouldn't mind filling out the survey once the webinar has ended, we'd love to hear what you think. And if you have any webinar topics, it's crazy to believe we're already halfway through October, so we're planning for 2026. So if you have any topics you'd like to see Houseman cover, you can throw that in the survey. And with that, oh, I'll do one more reminder that you guys will be getting your Amazon gift cards in 48 hours from Arctic Wolf, so keep an eye out for that. If you have any questions about that, just feel free to email me and I'll connect you with someone at Arctic Wolf. But otherwise, thank you so much for joining us and have a great rest of your day.